All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back with the Big Boys Table. This is episode 8, and the topic of this discussion is going to be casting environments and motivation. As usual, I'm joined by IskatuMesk, and we're going to be talking about stuff like commentating over replays of multiplayer games, let's plays of single player games, and all sorts of different things that are related to that. Probably delve into some voice acting and whatnot in there as well, since it's pretty linked. I figure we can start off with some easy and topical stuff, which would be environments, equipment. I know that you wanted to talk about some microphones and stuff that you were looking into. So why don't you start us off there?
Okay, so microphone. So, as I'm sure the vast majority of people who listen to this have some association primarily with StarCraft and more likely custom campaigns, obviously, StarCraft campaigns are associated with voice acting, and that's actually something that's very unique to StarCraft. There are not too many communities like StarCraft's in which voice acting is so prevalent. And something I've also noticed is there's not really a lot of discussion about the hardware as well. At least I've only ever talked to Labyrinth a little bit about hardware, and that's it, and not really that in depth. Since he hasn't done voice acting for quite a long time. However, there was, of course, the Star Alliance Voice Actors Guild, Savage. You may or may not remember. I think I may have been one of the only people who ever made use of them, actually. But again, voice acting was a big thing with StarCraft. So there seems to be a lot of people who are updating campaigns or thinking about making campaigns or otherwise introducing themselves to. Uh-oh, that's bad. Uh-oh. Uh,
Technical difficulties on your end, or?
No, I did something horrible. So there's obviously a lot of people who might be thinking about getting into voice acting who may have thought about it in the past but decided maybe they didn't want to. Maybe they were discouraged, etc. And while doing research on upgrading my hardware in the recent couple days, I did come across a lot of videos on YouTube. Unfortunately, I was forced to use YouTube for this that stated that hardware is complicated to get into and a lot of people are scared by it. Which, of course, is, to me, that seems ridiculous because it's so very, very simple. So what I would like to talk about today, at least in part, is just getting acquainted with the concept of recording with hardware and the two major setups you're going to be looking at if you would like to get into voice acting or casting. So it's true that if you are publishing content to YouTube, you probably don't need to invest any more than like $10 or $20 into a microphone because YouTube will destroy it. It will destroy everything you throw at it.
Yeah, with
But
audio, it definitely compresses and crunches a bunch of stuff. So
yeah.
best laid
So
plans kind of go to waste with that sort of platform.
if you're not familiar with what that is, there's two kinds of compression in regards to audio, and I will be making references to both kinds of compression. So there's the format compression. That's like, MP3, OGG, FLAC, WAV. Something could be lossy, something could be lossless. So that's their format compression. And then there is compression in terms of dynamics compression, or a compressor, as they're more typically called. And what a compressor is it is a filter that is used to balance audio. If you think back to old movies, like an old westerner, you got two cowboys facing off and they're having dialogue and they stop talking and you hear like this rise up of background noise, this static and stuff that boosts up, and then sometimes like the next time they talk their voices may be a little louder. That's a very basic example of a compressor in action. A compressor modifies the sound based sometimes on frequencies, but most often and more importantly based on how loud they are. So a rudimentary compressor will, for example, raise your lower volumes up and drop your higher volumes. So the reason why I talk about that with regards to hardware is because a compressor is ultimately something you are going to want to be using regardless of what you're producing sound work for. And it's something you should consider when you are choosing your hardware is what is your target environment. If you're going to be building something for YouTube, then you don't really need to do any research whatsoever. You don't really need to care too much about what you're doing because YouTube is going to destroy your end product. There's no point in recommending you to spend like $200, $300, $400 on hardware if the end result's going to be bad. And with YouTube, it's always bad. So, but for a campaign, even though StarCraft uses a very, very heavily compressed format, it's 22 kHz wave, you can still get some results out of using better hardware. But if you're targeting something like StarCraft 2 or Warcraft 3 or some other platform in which you can use a more standard wave or an OGG or a FLAC or something like that, then it helps to have the hardware. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is my experiences looking up the differences between USB and XLR. So chances are, if you've looked at microphones in the past, you probably saw something like a headset. There's a lot of people who try to get away from headsets. Don't use those. Don't use laptop microphones. They're all garbage. And then maybe something like the Yeti. It's very common. Or the Snowball Blue. Those are from the company called Blue. They're very popular, especially for people just starting casting. The Yeti is a USB microphone. It's going to run you around $200 Canadian, about $150 or so American. And you can produce high-quality studio recordings with the Yeti. But you're going to want to pay very close attention to your environment. And I'll get into that in a few minutes, so don't worry if you don't really know where I'm going with this. But the microphone I'm using right now, and I know it sounds like shit because Discord destroys it, because Discord is actually worse than YouTube. It uses something called Opus. It's garbage. And
Skype, dude.
Yeah, it's the same thing Skype used. It's horrible. And oh my fuck. So the Yeti is your baseline. Think of it as your baseline. You want to spend a lot of money on a setup. You want to get into voice acting for a campaign. You want to do LPs. You want to do stuff like that. Okay. You're probably looking at the Yeti as your baseline reference. This is what a lot of people are using. The other microphones in Blue's line, like the Snowball, are cheaper, but their sound is very similar to the Yeti because I believe they're using very similar hardware. They're just not as feature complete. So the Yeti is a USB microphone. Now, what does that mean? What is the difference between a USB microphone and an XLR, and why should I give a shit? Well, traditional microphones are used like a 3.5 millimeter. You would stick those into your sound card or something like that. Chances are you're going to get a ton of background noise. I used some of those for quite a few years. I used a USB Mac microphone, $10. I used that for about 15 years or close to it. I started my first StarCraft campaigns with it. I was voice acting LPs with it all the way until about 2001, 2002 or something like that. And I had that microphone forever, basically, and tape decks. And the USB microphone has two major components to it you should be aware of. There's obviously the microphone itself. You talk into it, it processes your voice into an electronic signal. And it has another piece of hardware on it, a circuit board. And the circuit board is taking that signal and transforming that into the USB signal that goes into your computer. All XLR is that circuit board is its own piece of hardware. And the connection you use between the microphone and that interface is the XLR cable. It's an analog cable. It's bigger and thicker than a USB cord. And it's a standard that has not changed for a very long time, and pretty much, I think, since its inception. So you're going to find that pretty much every actual major recording environment uses XLR because primarily of the fact it offers more flexibility. So if you were really serious about audio, you wanted more control over your hardware and what your hardware is doing. You wanted more access to your signal that your microphone is sending your computer before it gets into your computer. And I'll tell you the advantages for that in a few moments here. Then you're going to want to go with XLR. If all you're doing is just thinking about starting voice acting for a StarCraft 1 campaign and you don't really want to invest heavily into it, then you stick with USB. Because you can still get professional quality sound. So, I'll talk about the motivation and stuff in a little while here, because that will be its own thing. But I've used USB microphones since 2000. I don't know when I got that USB Mac microphone, but I used 3.5 for a really long time, and then I used a USB microphone, and they were both cheap pieces of shit. And I used those for voice acting StarCraft total conversions from 1998 all the way up to 2009. And I would say even today, the sound quality of those samples are superior to pretty much any StarCraft campaign or mod that had been made prior to 2009. I don't think I've ever heard any samples in any campaign for StarCraft to that point that came close to what I was capable of accomplishing with a $10, $20 microphone. Some people had good voices and could do relatively decent sounds, but it was a combination of my environment and my post-processing that gave me a superior sound. So just because you're using a cheap piece of hardware, don't think you can't do good things with it. And therefore, don't be too scared to not want to invest heavily. However, what I will say is, if you actually want to get into voicing and casting, and you're looking at spending a bit more bank in it, like $200, $300 worth, I think you should just jump immediately into XLR and just ignore USB entirely. The reason for this is that XLR microphones, at least from what I've been researching, are significantly cheaper than their USB counterparts. So right now I'm using the AT2020 USB. It's a difference of about $100. It literally becomes doubly expensive in Canadian from what I was looking at. So yeah. XLR has a lot more competition in its markets for the hardware. This is important because you want there to be competition. From what I have seen in USB, at least for this price range, the Yeti really only has the AT2020 for comparison. If you want my quick review on those two microphones, the Yeti is better for recording videos because the gain control on it is something you do not typically have on USB microphones, and it's very, very useful for balancing your audio. Balancing volumes is super important for me because I use Fraps to record my videos because OBS is far too system intensive. So I use Fraps. I end up with an audio stream that is merged game and voice microphone audio. I need those volumes to be very predictable. I need the game to be low and my voice to be medium to high, so I can post-process those in a way that levels them out very favorably. With the Yeti, this was pretty easy to achieve by using gain. Gain is like volume, but it's different. You can raise your gain and lower your volume and end up with a more consistent sound than just raising your volume. The AT2020 doesn't have that, but the sound quality in it is definitely superior to the Yeti. It has a tighter pickup, which is to say that it picks up a lot less background noise than the Yeti, even though both of them support the cardioid pattern, which is like a frontal cone. If you want to do strictly voice acting, get the AT2020. But be prepared to tinker a lot with it. Be prepared to tinker a lot with them both. So, microphone and hardware. The second big thing I would like to immediately introduce any would-be voice actor or caster to is your environment. So if you're sitting inside a closet and there's like no clothing in it and you talk, you're going to hear an echo. Guess what? The microphone picks up that echo too. If you're sitting in a room and you have like a closet behind you, the closet is painted over, that's going to reflect audio. You're going to get reverb. If you use something like a compressor that modulates the sound quality, that's going to get boosted. It's going to boost your background noise. Get accustomed to the concept of acoustics and isolating your sound. Look up acoustic shields. You don't necessarily need to use them, but you do need to consider what your environment is doing to your voice. You don't want a lot of background audio like cars or dogs barking or stuff. If you have a very noisy environment, I would recommend looking at dynamic microphones instead of condensers. Condensers are like studio microphones. They're intended to be very sensitive. They're ones that typically pick up a lot of background audio. But you can get condensers that are more tighter than others. That's what I was talking about in regard to their the way they pick up the audio. The AT2020, you almost hear no background audio on my end at all with that. The Yeti would pick up quite a bit. For example, behind me I have curtains, but they're made out of like cloth. They absorb audio very well. They're a lot better than, say, plastic blinds that will bounce stuff around. So you don't have to spend the like $500 per acoustically treated panels like what is recommended on many of these quote-unquote audiophile websites, just as you don't need to cover your walls in egg cartons either. You don't need to do either of those to get a good sound. What you do want to have is thick carpet. You can use a carpet for your chair, for example, as opposed to a plastic thing. If you have one of those cheap plastic things you roll your chair around on so it doesn't destroy your floor, get a thick carpet instead. Put carpeted cloth around and behind your monitor, and break up your room a little bit using stuff like cardboard boxes, blankets, clothes, stuff like that. Avoid hard painted or treated surfaces because they will reflect your audio around. The whole thing is that sound is energy. It's waves, obviously. And the microphone will pick this up. And even if you don't really hear it, when you start throwing in processing like compressors and stuff, that's going to boost it up. And you're going to get this echo, this reverb. It's bad for casting. It's really bad for voice acting. So, think about your hardware and then think about where you're going to put it. You don't necessarily need a sound booth. You don't need a studio. You don't need to hire out a space at a place to do your acting. All you need to do is just kind of rearrange your room and stuff a little bit. I'm kind of fortunate in that the roof above me is like an office ceiling. It's like pocketed, kind of light, cardboardy, composite kind of stuff. It absorbs sound really well. This house is absolutely terrible for sound bleeding. There's no drywall or anything. There's background noise anywhere. I can hear people snoring from across the street. But there's very, very little reverb going around from my voice. So, as opposed to the last place I was at with the Yeti, I had a closet beside me. I had a bathroom behind me. You listen to between the two. It's terrible. I can't speak much for the quality differences between XLR and USB. While a lot of people claim that XLR has superior quality because the signal is cleaner, and in most cases you get 24-bit as opposed to 16-bit audio, there is actual no videos that I could find, or more preferably, lossless samples that actually compare these together. The AT2020 and the Yeti both have USB and XLR versions. You think comparing the two would be easy because you would simply have somebody make recordings with both those versions under the same conditions and say, hey, here's the differences. But apparently nobody has common sense to actually do that. Or if they do, Google has not actually managed to fucking find it yet, nor has DuckDuckGo for that matter. So the information is difficult to find. So what I would like to do is when I actually have this hardware in possession, I do intend to make some comparisons and I do intend to test it, and I will get back to you guys on how that goes. Even though my tests are hardly going to be a widely generalized application, it's still something that, still information I want to get out. I'm obviously a hard ass. I'm an elitist. I'm a person who tries to pursue quality and reviews based on quality as much as possible. But I do so with the intent of education. I do so with the intent of helping people improve. And if there's a way I can use this hardware I have acquired and this research I've done to kind of increase the awareness of the advantages or disadvantages to investing in different setups, then I'm going to do it. But speaking from my experience right now, the research that I did was worthless. There's absolutely no point in reading up on XLR versus USB on the internet, because every place I have seen, from shit sites like Reddit to places like YouTube, the information is actually objectively worthless. It's mostly people that says, oh, the technical specifications are better on this hardware, so it's better, but it's like they don't give you any real-world examples to go by. Like, should I spend an extra $200, $400 on something that you're only going to hear in the tiniest, most niche of circumstances? Probably not. But you can't make that judgment without having the information on hand, and words are worthless when it comes to an actual microphone. So, yeah, so obviously I do a lot of audio related stuff, not just casting over videos and stuff like this podcast, but voice acting and stuff. And if anybody ever has any specific inquiries they wish to make in regards to audio or audio hardware, I may be able to answer it. I'm definitely not an expert on it, but I've worked alongside, especially like, making the most out of like low end systems and environments and stuff for a long time. With mods and stuff. So if you guys ever have something you'd want to inquire about that, then just let me know, and maybe we could address it in this podcast.
So I'll start us off in that department, because what I wrote down here from what you were saying was that one of the things that I sort of took away from what you were saying anyways was that echo and reverb that occur naturally depending on not only what microphone you use, but especially your environment, seems to be the biggest concern. At least it's what you stressed the most in that little bit. So would you say that that is the most destructive element or the biggest red flag that you would have about a setup, or the most important thing to nail down and avoid would be trying to minimize your echo and reverb, especially when you're doing something as regularly as you or I do with audio, where you're really
Yeah.
trying to get into it and make it a habit or a hobby or whatever the case may be.
So let's say you've already got hardware you like. You spent like 100, 200, 300, 400, $2,000 on a microphone
Mm-hmm.
and an interface or USB setup or whatever. It's going to sound like utter shit if you've got background noise. It doesn't matter how good it is. If there's other information ending up in the signal than your voice, you have to deal with that information after it's been embedded in there. And the thing about audio information is noise removal is only so good. There's only so many ways you can remove noise. You can't really remove vocals from music, for example, unless its stereo presence is very different from the other. Like, for example, if the voice is very centralized and the music is panned out on the stereo, there's ways you can tackle it that way. Else, you're looking at either based on volumes or based on frequencies. And the thing about background noise is it typically shares at least some frequencies with most voices, which means if you remove something based on a profile of that background audio, even if it's very low, it's going to affect your voice. And then you throw something like compressors on it. If you have like a little bit of a reverb, like I can even hear a little bit of reverb on my voice right now. It's not perfect. That's why I have an isolation shield for when I actually get serious about doing this stuff, because it cancels out most of that. But if I apply a compressor to my voice, you're going to hear the second sound every single time I talk. And that is the reverb, and it's changing my voice. Now, if you're doing a heavily processed sound file, like Protoss or Zerg or something like that, every single effect you add to it creates noise. Every single thing you do to your voice is adding in more information and distorting more information. And I have always been a proponent of using the lowest number of effects possible to achieve what you need. For most of my most heavily edited voices, I use maybe 2 or 3 effects tops. That's including reverb and stuff. Because I find that the more effects you throw into things, the more incomprehensible it becomes, even if those effects are relatively minor. Take, for example, the Overmind within StarCraft 2. Look at that as an example of what not to do. It's terrible. And when you have background noise on top of it, be it like the humming of a fan or reverb from your room or something like that, you pretty much have to remove it because it's destroying the quality of your sample. And no matter what you do, chances are you're not going to have a flawless removal unless you're very lucky in how that sound is being produced. So this is something you can tackle without spending money on it, generally speaking. You can improve your environment just by using household objects or repositioning yourself or your equipment and not have to invest something into it. And I imagine a lot of people who are doing voice acting or looking at doing voice acting don't have a lot of money to invest, or especially a lot of space to invest in setting up a very conditioned environment. So looking at things in your environment that you can use to change things around, and studying how sound works to a layman's level, what surfaces produce the most noise and how you can dampen it, can go a long way to improving the recording sampling of your existing hardware or low quality hardware without actually improving your hardware. Like I said, I was able to achieve studio quality with a Yeti, and most YouTube samples you hear of the Yeti are just atrocious. They're just god-awful, and it's not really the fault of the hardware. So, yeah, I would say it's a pretty big deal.
All right. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is, at least in my experience, it's possible to actually change your environment to apply a different effect. I mean, the obvious example for me is always like if I'm trying to do a ghost voice sample from StarCraft, I usually have a cup held up to my face, so I'm talking like this, and it's very serious. But typically that has the effect of making it feel like this guy's muffled by some sort of mask or helmet or something. Whereas, a typical Marine, their face has a little bit more freedom, their voice has a little bit more freedom to go directly into a radio, you would presume. So there's ways to alter your environment in a more direct way. But it goes back to that idea of where you were mentioning XLRs and how they offer a specific amount of additional control over the voice sample before it gets turned into a digital audio inside the computer. Like before it even hits your machine, it's going through its own hardware level compression, or not necessarily compression, but whatever it may be. You have a little bit more control over the the sound before you even
Yep.
stop hitting the record button, which I think is a big deal there. So it's sort of the same principle but applied in a different way. The idea that you can control your environment to produce more favorable results that you would have a hard time achieving by virtue of post-processing, be it noise removal or trying to replicate that voice in a cup type sound as a filter or a compressor or something like that afterwards. So I do want to really hit home on the idea that you should use as few effects as possible and the idea of minimalist voice design, because one of the things that I think it was in one of your educational videos regarding voice processing was that I took to heart personally when I was in the middle of trying to get voice acting done, some years ago for a campaign, was the idea that I think you attributed this to the Eastern sort of idea of audio, where every sound is really impactful and important, but short-lived, so that it clears space for the next set of sounds. So I might be somehow misconstruing it or getting some things wrong, but the specifics are not as important as I think the general principle, which is the idea that you should make your effects potent, make them tangible, but not have them take up too much audible space, because the idea is that if they're too noisy, if they go on for too long, then they're distracting from other audio within the same sound or within the next sound that needs to take center stage at that point. So you can think of it like sort of a play where there are multiple actors. Well, the first actor needs to do their piece and then move on quickly and get out of the way of the next actor, and it's a procession of things where one of them is not necessarily taking up more screen space or stage presence than the rest. At least that has been a pretty good guiding philosophy for me. I don't know if you have anything in particular to expound upon that, but I think that that's a pretty good thing to hammer into newcomers or people who are not as well versed in the idea or the hobby of doing voice acting and voice editing afterwards. They hear the Protoss in StarCraft 1 or the Overmind in StarCraft 1 or wherever they're drawing inspiration from. A lot of the times people think that the way that they need to mask their voice with a lot of edits is because maybe they're not as comfortable with their acting itself, and they think that the edits will make the acting. But that's not
actually probably the biggest challenge that most new actors are going to overcome. Is
definitely, I would say that I always looked at it like I'm going to achieve the best out of the edits, the post-processing. That's the exciting stuff, because I know my voice, because I've spoken with my voice for the longest time. But you don't really know how much you can manipulate and torture your voice into individual, different voice profiles, until you really go at it with a lot of repeated tries to nail a certain character. And for me, one of the best ways to do it was try to nail impressions of other people, where I'm still terrible at it, but that is moving way past my comfort zone and trying to mimic a specific voice. The Overmind, Aldaris, whatever the case may be. You have all sorts of samples that you can draw upon, and you can say, I really like this voice, I'm going to try and mimic it. I'm going to try to mimic Homer Simpson, he's an easy one. Arnold Schwarzenegger, everybody can do him. And, if you can start out with those easy ones and then see, I try to identify what you're changing about your voice, maybe you can extrapolate that some way. But the acting is more important, I would say, than the edits, especially if you're going with this minimalist style where the edits are accessory to the acting itself. You're not going to make your acting stronger than through the edits than you would through mastering how to act in the first place, I would say.
A lot of people have told me that they have a lot of discomfort with their own voice. Actually, that's actually probably the biggest hurdle I've seen a lot of people come. This is what tends to train them into using a lot of effects, is because they hate the sound of their own voice. I've heard that so many times. So many people don't like the sound of their own voice, and this ends up prohibiting them from becoming actors or pursuing stuff. For example, there is someone I know, and she streams art. She's very good at drawing stuff, and it has no voice commentary whatsoever. So if she has to talk to people, she has to use the chat or draw it out with a tablet or whatever. And for years and years and years and years, I've tried to get her to do voice. And I think especially if you're streaming stuff, especially if you wanted to talk about your art while you're streaming it, it's easier than taking your hands off of your tablet and your stylus and start typing stuff out or whatever. So it breaks your chain of stuff, and it's easier to vocalize what you're doing. But she hates the sound of her voice so much but she won't even attempt it. She says she'll try it sometime, but it's like it's something that she wants to get big on streaming. Obviously, wants to get more viewers and stuff like that. And the thing about streaming is obviously communication is really the main thing about streaming. It's the only advantage that streaming has over direct download is, being able to communicate to your audience directly. And that's how the big streamers make it big, is by communicating and interacting with their audience. And the primary way you're going to be able to do that is through vocalization. So if people really struggle with their voice, you're going to find they're going to be really quiet. And then there's going to be no real interaction. And for me, I don't stream, and I never would stream, but I try to vocalize everything I'm thinking or doing. And I don't really like my voice either. And I hated my voice for a really long time, but I did voice acting out of necessity. Because, like, who else is going to voice act my projects? No one, right?
Yeah, it's exactly the same way that I started out, was asking people to do voice acting for me, realizing they, either it was an unreasonable amount of lines for other people to do, or just that it wasn't going to happen because there weren't any interested parties, and I had to do it myself.
But for me, it was easy because prior to StarCraft, I already had like 8 years of experience doing voice acting because I grew up with a tape deck. We couldn't afford things like cable TV or anything like that, but I had a tape deck and I had cassette tapes. So ever since I was like a toddler, I did like voice acting and stuff and just like silly things with a tape deck. So I was already really comfortable with the sound of my voice. I didn't like it, but I was comfortable using it to do voicing. So when I started doing voice acting on the PC in 1998, I already had more experience doing voicing than most people who are doing campaigns today have. So that was obviously a big boon. And that's what made it kind of hard for me to understand how people don't like the sound of their own voice. But the thing is like we discussed before, or at least I think, maybe it was in one of my videos I discussed this, but a lot of people who end up doing custom content do it for themselves because they are typically more isolationist in their lifestyle. They want to make something they themselves enjoy, either because they have high standards or because they want to create something. They tend to be people who are not super extroverted, if you will. Some of them are, but a good chunk of the ones that I've dealt with are not. And even like some guys who do like a lot of really, really heavy lifting modding, like reverse engineering, graphics, stuff like this for years, like decades, like even longer than me. They still don't really want to get into voicing, on the spot. They still don't really just want to start voicing stuff. And because they're so uncomfortable with the voice, they don't really like their voice, that they're going to get embarrassed or whatever. And they don't want to put themselves through that. And like, would I tell people who want to get into voice acting but struggle with that problem is to actually do casting and commentary first. I recommend people to record games that they're playing and talk. It doesn't have to be something you ever upload. In fact, you probably don't want to. I only recently, within like 2010, started posting stuff on the internet. I had created videos and stuff long before then. I created stuff on VHS back when GoldenEye 007 first came out. I was doing like science and stuff, like breaking things in games long before I started posting stuff on the internet. And the whole idea of getting other people to do that before they get into like voicing a campaign is to get accustomed to talking to yourself. Get accustomed to hearing how your own voice sounds, especially when it's just a solo conversation. Because once you get comfortable with that, once you understand how you sound and how you can change that sound, then it becomes so much easier to do actual acting. And I am of the opinion that there isn't any person who cannot do acting, so long as they actually want to. So long as they actually want to get into it. This is the biggest, number one, most major thing. You have to be driven to do it. You have to have the motivation to do it. Otherwise, it doesn't matter if you have 5 years experience. It doesn't matter if you have 25 years experience. What you're going to make is sound like shit, just like StarCraft 2. StarCraft 2 has a bunch of big name actors in it that all sound bored as fuck. Kerrigan is bored as fuck. Raynor is bored as fuck. They want their paycheck. They want to go back to their cocaine. They don't want to have to deal with this shitty fucking game anymore. They sound bored as fuck. You can hear in their voices they have experience. They know how to use their voices. but there is no pressure from their job. There's no engagement from their job. How are you going to get engaged as a new voice actor or a new caster? Well, that should be easy. You're doing it because you want to do it. Don't do it if you don't want to do it. Otherwise, you're not going to be encouraged by your results. You're not going to feel encouraged by your results. And it should be something you're doing for yourself to begin with. So I would highly recommend getting into commentary. Play something you enjoy playing. Do some competitive Hearthstone. Win some tournaments. You know, play Minecraft. Play Sonic ASMR. And record your voice and just talk about what you're doing and why you're doing it. You know, I'm playing the Vor hand because I'm really into Vor. And I like big holes, and I like being eaten. You just like string out your flow of consciousness. And then, you know, you never have to release the video until there's like a competition for Vor or something, if ever. And, you know, and congratulations, you've just finished a project. You've finished your first voice acting project, and that will be an empowering feeling. And you want to get accustomed to that. You want to get accustomed to the process. Because once you get into voice acting, once you spend, you know, a couple months, couple years, couple decades doing voice acting, it becomes kind of a mechanical process, but you always still want to preserve that passion for it. Because the second you become dispassionate for it, voice acting especially is something that's really going to suffer from that. So, you know, when I say do it because you want to do it, I don't just mean when you're starting off. I mean, if you ever do not feel like doing it, don't do it.
One of the things that I think is really, really neat is the fact that you're like when you recommend people start with commentating. The reason why I think that's a really good suggestion is precisely because it will teach you to become comfortable with your voice. And the whole idea of wanting to get into voice acting, aspiring to be a caster or a commentator in some respect, I mean, you're asking other people to listen to your voice and at least tolerate it, if not, enjoy your mannerisms or your personality that you're conveying through this voice. And by vocalizing, by listening to yourself back, by just maybe hooking up a listener in the audio device so you're hearing yourself live while you're speaking so you can tell what exactly your voice sounds like. I mean, especially if you don't like your voice to begin with, that particular approach will probably suck, but you know, it'll only suck for a while, and then you'll get used to your voice. And then you'll say, well, if I don't like this about my voice, let me try and change it. And is that a reasonable change to make? Is the vocabulary that I'm using, is that worthwhile? Should I dispense with something that way? Should I try and update how I actually communicate in a different way? Should I update the way that I speak? You know, do I say and like too much? I do. So that's something that I'm always trying to fix, is the idea that I have a thought and I'm trying to translate that thought from my brain to my voice, speak it into existence, and then somehow figure out how to do that without stuttering. I mean, it's a miracle I finish any sentence at all to begin with. No. So the idea that you're not going to be 100% set from the get-go, and nobody should expect that either. And this is something that I struggle with that's a bit more broad, but can certainly be applied to this topic, is when I was thinking about why I was so dissatisfied with my work and why I always shot for high standards that I then found I could never reach, is not because I had a self-esteem issue and thought I wasn't good enough. It's because I was too self-absorbed and thought I was so good that what I should be producing or should be creating, I should be responsible for something that most entire teams of people can't create. And it's not that I would never be able to be, able to create something like that. It's not that I would never be able to reach those standards, but I shouldn't expect that of myself starting out, or even 5 years or 10 years down the line of trying to do something. And that's where you have to get in your head, I'm starting out in this thing, or I'm doing this thing for the first year or the fifth year, and I'm not a master, and there are people who have done this for their entire lives that are way more invested in the trade or the hobby or whatever the case may be, and they are still passionate about it, which means I can still be passionate about it if that's something that I want to do, and I can still learn when I'm in my 15th year into doing this. When I started when I was 8 years old and now I'm 27 or whatever the case may be. Like, you can do stuff like voice acting and commentating for a long time. It's not something that's going to go away anytime soon. And in fact, it's actually gotten way bigger in the recent history in terms of the other people that are doing it. So you have a lot of inspiration to draw upon if you follow your own people on, content creators in various forms, especially people who use YouTube. You're going to have people that you like to watch, and you're going to have things that you like about those people, and you can use those as inspiration. But even those people started somewhere, and I guarantee you they were shit when they began. They might still be shit now compared to where they're going to end up. So as long as you don't get too much into your head about the whole I holding myself to an unattainable standard, or it very well may be an attainable standard, but not for a newcomer, not for someone who's just starting out or who's relatively new to the hobby itself. I think you'll be fine. And a lot of people starting out, this is where I guess where we can divulge into the motivational side of the discussion. But I think a lot of people starting out, they have a certain goal that they want to reach, and then they realize they can't reach it, or that something in their process is preventing them from reaching it, as opposed to something external. It's something that they themselves are doing wrong, and they have to reevaluate everything, and sometimes that can just be crippling to anybody trying to do something. Maybe they realize that they've been speaking wrong their entire life, and they have to reevaluate the way that they form sentences, like we discussed earlier. So, I mean, there's something that could be that. It could be something that is a little bit less apocalyptic per se, but it's still going to be something that they are not happy with their project. And I think that's only natural, because you're always supposed to be aiming higher. You're always supposed to be challenging yourself. That's part of the way that you become invested and remain invested in what you're doing for a long period of time, is exploring new territory, trying to master what you're currently working on with the intent of using those skills to create something different and new that will require you to learn even more additional new skills. And obviously still practicing what you've already learned on the side. So I sort of went in a bunch of different ways there with that little tirade. But I guess what we can start talking about, if you're ready to move into this, is you had an audio book that you've created called Retribution. Yep. That was originally supposed to be a video production. So maybe we can talk about all of the things that were had to come into being in order for this to get where it was, and maybe its path originally, and how long it took you. And this might be a something of an inspirational story just in and of itself, and then we can maybe talk more about motivation in general.
Yeah, Retribution is it's a long-winded project. So I released Armageddon Onslaught in 2009. But by 2008, I mean, obviously I explored a lot of different games. I've done total conversions for like, I don't know, 2 dozen, 3 dozen games I've at least experimented somewhat heavily with. And didn't really find a lot of success in them. And I was really winding down on StarCraft. I'd basically reached what I felt was the limits of what I could do within that title. And I was exploring other games, obviously Warcraft 3, Sins of the Solar Empire, eventually. That's where this road takes us. And Homeworld 2. So I made a lot of what were called fleet mods within StarCraft. And obviously not really the best platform for a space combat. And obviously you wanted to go into something like Homeworld 2. And I tried to do that. But Homeworld 2's AI was particularly bad, and it wasn't really that good at graphics, actually. I was not really that good at graphics. So what I then wanted to do was, obviously that's when I was like really starting to try to learn modeling and stuff. I had been doing 3D modeling since 2002, 2001. I was introduced to NURBS Rhino 3D by War Giant, who you may or may not know. And it wasn't until Warcraft 3 I started doing polygon modeling. I mostly learned it off the back of learning how to port World of Warcraft assets. So then we reach 2008 and 2009, where I was starting to actually like get into 3ds Max and Maya and do stuff, get into stuff.
And Homeworld 2 is a 3D game, or I'm not
Yes.
personally familiar with it. So
It's you're not familiar with Homeworld 2? Okay, well, Homeworld is a space combat RTS, and Homeworld 2 is like a casual version of Homeworld. Homeworld was created by Relic. It was their sole franchise to claim as being decent up until Homeworld 2 came out. Now, Homeworld 2 wasn't necessarily a bad game, but it was inferior to Homeworld 1. Homeworld 1 had a lot more Z-axis and a lot more complexity about it. They're also well known for their more, at the time, iconic soundtracks, in which they introduced like the Middle Eastern kind of music to gaming. They were really like, because they really took the center stage with that. And you'll find that a lot of like space-based games have been like cloning off of them, especially like Strike Suit Zero and stuff like that. And along the way, Homeworld acquired a fair bit of custom content because it was basically amongst the only titles of its kind. So, what this all eventually equates into... Oh, God. That's what I need to do. I'm breaking up right now because I'm like trying to do research on stuff at the same time. So, all right. So Homeworld. So I was trying to do money for Homeworld and trying to get into graphics and stuff, and I could get my assets into Homeworld, but I discovered that Homeworld was actually really terrible. Homeworld 2 was really bad. Particle effects were basically entirely uncharted, and AI was entirely uncharted. So coming out of StarCraft, where I was basically like a god, I could do anything I wanted at any point. If it was within the game's capability minus reverse engineering, because I didn't know ASM, I could accomplish it. So I could make effects in 3ds Max, I could render stuff out, I could do iScript, I could do data, I could do AI. You know, obviously you can do a lot more now with Nive making
yes.
you those plugins and stuff like that. We didn't have those back then, so there's obviously more limitations. But I had effectively pioneered much of StarCraft at that stage. To go from that to something like a Homeworld, where you couldn't even do custom effects or AI at all, it was very, very discouraging. Very discouraging. And all that came out of Homeworld was basically a couple of test videos. And people really liked the test videos. People really, really liked the test videos. It was something new and original, and most of the mods for that game are basically just kit bashes. So eventually I left that game, and I decided to check out Sins of a Solar Empire. Sins of a Solar Empire is a very, very shitty mix between a 4x and an RTS, created by a C-tier company known as Ironclad and published by scumbags known as Stardock. And Sins of a Solar Empire was more inviting for mods and had a way better community behind it than Homeworld 2 did. But it was a trap, and traps are gay.
How did you get involved with Sins of a Solar Empire? Because prior to your involvement with it, I had never even heard of the game. Like prior to you talking about it, it
honestly
was completely out of the blue.
Don't remember. I don't remember how I got involved with it at all. I actually don't recall. I think someone may have introduced me to it. Is maybe what happened. Someone introduced me to it because I was scouting for a lot of games. This was the year I was really scouting for Project Offset. Project Offset was a game engine. I forget who was building it, but it was looking to be super promising. You can think of Project Offset as basically like a predecessor to Unreal 4 in terms of just how it looked and the kind of features it was going to offer you. So before then, I had obviously scouted out stuff like Source Engine and, you know, Unreal 3 and stuff like that. But UDK didn't exist back then. So, you know, if you wanted to get into Unreal 3, you needed like a license, and that wasn't going to fly. And Unreal 2004 and stuff like that was like far too advanced for me to get into, especially since I was just starting to learn like the basics of 3D. I'm a very slow learner. I am terrible at learning. I don't do this learning thing very well. I was modeling and doing mods nonstop with models, doing 3D graphics and everything related since 2002. It was 2008. I still could barely produce a boxy ship with no UV maps or textures. And to this day, today, I'm not really that much better. I'm really not that much better. So to go into something that really required like super in-depth skills just to change to what I wanted, because I still wanted to make mods. I still wanted to make fleet mods and stuff like that. I was very conscious of myself. I was very conscious of my abilities and lack thereof. Because Armageddon Onslaught had been a utter pain in the ass. And I had released it with a crash that was still in it because I didn't possess the skills to deal with the reverse engineering, and I was stuck with Disciple of Adun trying to figure it out. But he couldn't figure it out. He was the one who made the limit expander and stuff like that. And it was like a miracle it even worked, and he didn't even know how it managed to work. It was one of those just unspeakable things you try not to stick with a twig too many times because the whole goddamn fence might come crashing down. So, I wanted to be independent. And I wanted to do things at my own way, my own pacing, and learn on my own skills. But that's the thing about modding is you don't make mods if you want to be independent. You make mods because you're making concessions. And the big concession about mods is you can't make your own engine. Or you don't possess the skills to take a ready-made engine, like, say, Source, and do something with it. Like the Black Mesa or whatever it was. So Sins of a Solar Empire was more inviting because its data format was very simplistic and upfront. So when you go through this many games trying to learn things, you learn their pipelines. Basically, my process was I would find the big community, I'd ask a bunch of questions, and then I would try to introduce assets and make functional units. And this was like a conceptual probe. My whole idea was, okay, I learn how this game works at a superficial level. This is what it takes to put assets into the game. This is what it takes to make a unit. This is what it takes to put sounds in the game. This is what it takes to put in, like, AI support, to make the AI build my new units, to put in voice acting. And in a lot of these games, these super basic things you're asking about, how do you do these basic introductions? How do you do that? They're actually impossible. Like, let's take, for example, Supreme Commander was the game I looked at. It was claimed to be entirely open other than a handful of things. Well, I tried to make an air unit that didn't perpetually backpedal. That's actually, as far as I could tell, and as far as the forum knew, impossible in that game. I couldn't have a starship that functioned like ones within StarCraft that stood there and fought. They would always circle at their max range like gunships, or they would fly around like fighters. If you use the deploy system, like tanks and some other things used in that game, the unit would automatically deploy to anything that entered range, and it would refuse all player interaction. You could not get it to do anything until units had left its range. And after asking for months to figure out how to fix that, it was just concluded that this was actually impossible. It was actually impossible to do what I wanted. So this was the most open game, allegedly, that I had yet to find. So, Supreme Commander, never again.
And, that's just crazy to me that they don't have basic, like, air unit behaving similar to a ground unit behavior in their game.
For all I know, it's possible. It's just nobody knew how such a basic thing could be done. So what happens when I try to do something advanced?
Yeah, that's a pretty dangerous precedent to set. One of the reasons why Brood War, for example, is so enticing to work with if you're going to be making mods, because there's not a lot of unknowns in that game, and especially with the latest tools that we have now, you're not going to be wanting for much in the form of things like AI and custom units and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, it's certainly a much different game now than it was a decade ago. That's for sure. Because before, it's like you couldn't dream of doing the AI doing the stuff that you did now. Like, you guys were talking about something that makes the AI cancels outstanding orders. Well, I'm sure that's like where 69% of my problems came from.
Yeah, so the AI, it has a request log, and it can only handle one request at a time, but it just processes them very, very quickly. Like, if you tell it to upgrade infantry armor and infantry weapons at the same time, it'll just process both of them, as long as it has two vacant engineering bays that aren't doing anything. But if, for example, you tell it to do anything that requires a weight, so you have weight build or weight upgrades after a build request or an upgrade request, or you have, I think it's not train. It's a I don't remember the exact command, but there is one command where it's intrinsic in it is a wait. It waits until this request is finished, and you can't separate it from that wait. Well, if it is waiting for a request that it can never complete because you've disabled the unit in the editor, which is very common with custom campaigns, then it'll just hang up. With the latest technology, it will just say, hey, I can't complete this, so I'm going to delay it for 15 seconds and recheck it again then. And it will do that indefinitely for every request. It's almost like it's a real request log instead of just this
it's
thing
almost
that
like it's a
hangs
real
up.
AI now, huh?
Yeah, it's insane.
That's so bizarre.
But
yeah,
that is just a constant issue with a lot of these games. And like you were saying, you were initially looking into Sins of the Solar Empire, looking to make a fleet mod, not to make an audio book, or before that it was a machinima, right? So
obviously it took a very long, bizarre road to get to that location.
Yeah, so the question I was going to ask is how you had settled on being a machinima in the first place. I don't know if you're...
So we're getting to that stage.
Sure.
So in 2010, StarCraft 2 has not come out. I am skeptically optimistic. Obviously, very burned by Warcraft 3 and the total lack of support from Blizzard and Brett Wood's responses to me on their official forums in regards to adding support or fixing Warcraft 3's innumerable problems, such as this AI and editor. So after learning that guy was StarCraft 2's lead for the editor, I had basically no hope for that game, but I was optimistic because in my eyes, I had tamed the beast that was Brood War. I had worked with all this garbage, this hideous, busted shit, and still managed to make projects out of it. So at the time, I still had like a lot of patience. I was still willing to do, probably too much to achieve what I wanted. And what is this guy doing? So Sins of the Solar Empire is like, it's like the Brood War of 3D games. Again, like Homeworld 2, it's not 3D, but unlike Homeworld 2, it doesn't even try to fake being 3D. There's no moving turrets. There's AI is completely, totally hard-coded. You don't have access to any scripts. There's no triggers, like in StarCraft or Warcraft 3. All ability interactions are handled through buffs, and nothing is documented whatsoever. To get 3D assets into the game, you have to use a very, very niche program called Soft Image XSI, which I believe was actually Autodesk's original product. Or maybe, I think maybe Mayo was. I don't know, but Autodesk possessed Soft Image, and it's garbage. It's trash. It is the worst 3D application I've ever used except for Blender. And you have to use an exporter for that. I mean, at least they had an exporter they released. Blizzard didn't have that for 4 years after StarCraft 2 came out. So, you gotta take your victories when you can get them.
Right, so this is where you were talking about it having some sort of surface-level mod support or inviting community behind it.
So, it also had a particle editor. Now, I dealt with particles before with Warcraft 3. And Warcraft 3 hadn't taught me a lot about particles because I was using third-party tools, which were quite honestly terrible. And not something like 3ds Max. And Sins of the Solar Empire was an entirely new and wacky experience I was totally unprepared for, but I actually took a liking to. It wasn't very advanced. You don't have support for stuff like child particles, which Warcraft 3 did, and other sort of similar things. But over the course of the years, I actually really came to love working with particles, and that'd actually probably be like one of the strongest things I can do now today is particles. It's called technical art, and that was really one of the big attractions of that game because I was coming out of Homeworld 2. I had spent probably about a year or so off and on working with Homeworld 2, trying to, learn the ins and outs of it, and basically being told what you want is just entirely impossible. Whereas Sins of the Solar Empire had many really obvious limitations to it, but I still had hope that I could make a mod with it. But once it became obvious the AI was entirely inaccessible, I had determined that I can't make a mod. Also, the unit pathing and controls and stuff like that was absolutely horrendous. It was really, 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 really fucking bad. And that basically made me like eventually give up on making the mod. And then I went to StarCraft 2. I think this was around then. My timeline's going to be a little messed up. I think my actual project page may have more of an actual better timeline for it. But I went to StarCraft 2, and StarCraft 2's beta came out, and I was involved with that for a really long time. And I had basically at least held off on Sins of a Solar Empire for a while until I had basically had my fill of StarCraft 2, because the beta came out. I had a beta key. I did my coverage for that. And we did modding for StarCraft 2 within the first week of beta. We were doing XML changes, MPQ changes, sound mods, graphics mods, just like really basic stuff. I brought out the hidden lava terrain that was within the beta and showed that to everybody. And we were playing with lighting settings and post-processing settings and a bunch of other stuff like that. And I can't remember precisely what happened. My memory is foggy with this. But it was like StarCraft 2 came out and it was a horrendous failure, basically, like I had called it. And I went to do Sins stuff somewhere around this period. Basically, when I had ditched Sins from the mod, because basically I determined I just can't make the mod, I had decided, okay, we are going to just release this video I made of this stuff and call it quits. And move on to StarCraft 2.
And then you found out that StarCraft 2 was a disaster, or how did that go?
This was before I had like completely settled on just ditching StarCraft 2, because I was going to make Armageddon Onslaught too.
Right.
But Blizzard went on this crusade to kill modding. First they removed the folder hot loading, then they added CRC checks to the MPQs, and there was no 3D support other than the user made tool, which was really fucked up. And there was like just no sign that StarCraft 2 was going to ever be functional. And yeah, I went back to Sins because I had released a video called Episode 0. And Episode 0 was a really, really, really basic video. I had some just really cheap voice acting with my nice background fan audio going on from Summer, and some ships shooting each other in laggy Sins glory. Despite the fact the engine didn't support basic features like, you know, turrets and stuff, it actually performed worse than Homeworld. So that was always exciting. But I made this video, and a lot of people liked this video. And now I was at like, okay, my projects are effectively dead, right? For StarCraft, at least. So I had decided at that stage that, okay, I still had a story to tell, because Retribution and the conversion it came off of, originally known as Salvation back then because it was the first portion of it, it was based on conceptual novels for my world. And that was massive. That was a long-running project. That actually had been my life's work up to that point. I had been writing for that, and most of my mods I had made had been built on that world. So I looked at the positive feedback for Episode 0, even though it was objectively a piece of shit, and considered, you know, could I do something with this? I hadn't made Machinima before, but I wasn't a stranger to video productions. By that point, obviously, I had been casting StarCraft 2. I had been...
well, there's all the LPs that you had
LPs. LPs were not really a big thing for me at that stage, actually. I can't remember what I did the Wings of Liberty recording,
right.
But at that point, it really wasn't like, it wasn't really my big shtick. It wasn't really my big deal, and it became so afterwards because of Retribution and Salvation. I think is I wanted to make more. Like, I always saw casting and StarCraft 2 casting and LPs and stuff like that. I saw those as an aside. They were like a distraction, because at my heart I was a creator and I wanted to make stuff. And
it's so weird that this is 8 years ago that this I
Yeah.
remember this like very vividly. This that time
Looking
in my
back
life.
now, it seems so weird that this is the path that things took. You had Salvation. I decided I'm going to try to make a machinima. I'm going to try to tell the story through a video because I can't do it through a mod. I've been through several different games and they're all basically failures. So I want to make a machinima, and it was uncharted territory for me. I didn't know what to expect out of it. But I had created episode 1 or episode 0, and it was basically like this was received well. Maybe if I put real effort into it and real time into it, I can make something better. No. I was successful in making episode 1, Salvation. And do you want me to go into details for that? Because that one's long. That's going to be long. It's a mess. It ultimately results in me reinstalling Windows because I couldn't get Vegas to give me not broken files.
Oh yeah, that was
And
the famous Windows 7. You have an image of you flipping off the Windows 7 install disk.
yes,
That's probably where that
yes,
came from.
that is precisely where that came from. It was a fucking disaster. And you know what the end result was? It was not actually a problem with Windows or my codecs or anything whatsoever. The actual cause of that was Vegas has an option where it unloads stuff that's out of focus.
Yep.
It treats its own render window as being out of focus. So it would unload stuff that it needs to render, and you would just end up with blank pieces of the video. I spent about a year and a half making Salvation. Salvation was a machinima I released on YouTube. It was fully voice acted. It had, let's see, the Anan, the Undead, the Zykranesh, 3 races. And it was a fucking disaster. It was an absolute fucking train wreck. I'm so embarrassed by that. I'm really, really embarrassed by that. I had absolutely no problem saying I fucked that up really bad. I got so impatient with it. When I was encoding it and looking at it, it was like, what have I done? I've made such a mess of this. And it wasn't just because I wasn't like good at art or anything like that. It was just because I just wasn't good. It wasn't just I didn't have experience in the subject. It was that what I was looking at was something that I had been way too greedy with. Because I think it had decent voice acting, but the script writing and everything else was not indicative of my strengths. It was not an accurate reflection of what I was actually capable of doing. And it was ultimately because I had gotten very, very greedy.
Greedy in what sense? Because you're not standing to benefit from this in the normal profiteering manner.
Well, it's greedy in the sense that I wanted to release it. I wanted to get it done. So I didn't put in the time necessary to critique it, to really objectively look at it and ask really important questions like, does this flow well or anything like that? Especially since I had spent like 2 weeks trying to encode it. When I had finally encoded it, I was so relieved just to get it fucking done. I just wanted it released, and I didn't want to have to rate it because I'd already spent so long on it. But what I released was an objectively poor product. And after that, I felt absolutely disgusted with myself. I was really, really, really not happy with myself. And I ignored that for a long time. And then that's when I really, during this is when I started doing the LPs a lot. And I really, focused onto the LPs and trying to make something with that. And I think that LPs was a good idea because it distracted me a lot from a lot of that disgustingness. But eventually I wanted to do something to kind of redeem myself because I'm hardest most on myself. And I don't forgive myself for doing things wrong that I know I don't have any business doing wrong. Like you were talking about speech problems when you're doing casting and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I have really, really, really bad motor skills. Horrible from my disabilities. And they cause me problems all the time. Even today, even after I've been casting for so long, they still give me a lot of issues. And there's still a lot of times I say or or whatever, but there's more severe stuff. Really, really mixing up words and stuff. Things I just really shouldn't be doing. And I can't forgive myself for that. I can't forgive myself for doing things that I should, realistically speaking, shouldn't be having problems with anymore. And amongst these is Salvation. Salvation to me was like, it was one of the greatest disasters of all custom content that I had ever made. Even more disastrous than the stuff I had finished, because I had considered it finished, and it most certainly was not finished. It was just a train wreck. So I was not really willing to get back in a sense though, because I needed character representation for my characters in my production, and I didn't have that because I'm not an artist. So Killer 11, aka the coach, comes along and says, "Hey, I'm getting into making characters and stuff for Oblivion," and he showed some examples of like armor and stuff he had made or otherwise, like kit bash or whatever, and they were pretty impressive. And he says, "I could help you with your graphics." Oh, it was such a stupid idea to think he was serious. And this was someone I had known for over 10 years, I think. Like a really, really, really long time. So at the time, I didn't have any reason to believe he was not serious. And he did help me with making base shapes for some ship models and stuff like that. And I talked to him constantly. So this began the Retribution project. This was 2012, late 2012. I spent the rest of 2012, all of 2013, and a chunk of the beginning of 2014 working basically nonstop. And when I say nonstop, I mean I don't have a job or anything. I'm disabled, and I only had like cats to look after, which at that point didn't have life-threatening mental problems or physical problems rather, like their eyes. So I was able to commit basically anytime I wasn't casting videos. I was able to commit to making this project. So day in and day out. And at the end of the day, I had to cancel the project when I had basically finished all the Sins work. I had a huge chunk of stuff done within Unreal. I was basically like 70-80% completed the whole project graphically. All I really needed was the character models. I had never once seen any hint that Killer 11 had even intended to make character models because he never had actually attempted them. So now, enter 2014. The cat starts getting really, really severe perpetual eye ulcers. And everything is going straight to shit. And I'm basically looking at like, I can't port stuff and remaster it for Retribution because I'm not good enough. So I felt really disgusted with myself that we were this far into making content and I still couldn't deal with organic models at all. And I couldn't even port anything from something like, another game, and remaster it to suit what I needed either. I just didn't have the skills. So Retribution died. It was 2008 to 2014 of work. Just evaporates in an instant. And then all of the bitterness of, Salvation's failure is compounded now by Retribution's failure. And then to top it all off, a couple months later, we are told that we no longer have a home. And now you have to try to find a home in the most difficult to live place in the entire country. And the cat is basically dying because there's been months and months and months and months and months. Also, I had pneumonia. I almost died as well. And it was a huge shit show. It was really, really depressing. It was horrible. So believe me when I say I understand, how serious these projects can get, how much you care about them, how much you want to, build something, the kind of time and energy that it goes into making a project. And it's just a video. It was just like a couple hours long video. And I couldn't even do that. Like it was just disgusting. So we lose our home, and we end up moving here, and it is over twice as expensive. And I'm really, really depressed. The cat still has problems. The cat would continue to have problems until about 2.5, 3 years later. And I was then like asking myself, okay, what am I gonna do? Like, what should I do? I was still like experimenting with StarCraft 2, but I didn't want to make any projects anymore. I was just thoroughly destroyed. Just like emotionally and physically destroyed. And I just didn't want to do stuff anymore. But eventually someone suggested making the audiobook because I had the script completed. I had done dry runs and like testing voicing and everything for this video forever. And someone suggested to make a audiobook out of it. And this is something I had, like, obviously I said I did tape deck stuff, so I had like kind of an experience with this, but never like this.
Not
And
on the
I
same
can't remember.
scale, right?
Yeah.
Is the deal.
The scale was astoundingly and unexpectedly high. It was much more work than I had anticipated. I did decide to do it. I can't remember why I decided to do it, but I did. And now you might be thinking, oh, it's not a big deal because you are already a voice actor and have this much experience. But, Jesus. I was not prepared. I was not prepared because most of my voice acting experience after the tape deck was dialogue for total conversions. So individual lines for units, usually like 3, 4, 5 words. I could do that very well. And I had done casting for games. But now I needed to take the dialogue that I had created before, improve the script to account for having no visuals, and then make it believable in an audio-only environment. You don't think that's hard? You don't think it would be that difficult? And then you're spending 5 hours a night on one paragraph that you have struggled with for the past month because you just can't pronounce certain words correctly. That was Retribution. It was 2 months of basically relearning everything that I had learned to that stage and discovering that despite my experience in all this stuff, I was not at all prepared to make an audiobook.
See, that's interesting because it sort of combines a couple of points that we had brought up earlier in the podcast, where one of them was, don't get so upset if you find out that you're close to the completion of a project, but there's some fundamental issue you can't reconcile. And it might be something that's fundamental to your process or your, like, you as an individual, as opposed to just sort of the way that the product has been arranged, or the project has been arranged. The idea that, maybe you're not pronouncing words correctly, which is precisely the issue here for you. You're like relearning all of these years of experience that you've had as a voice actor and a commentator, and trying to make it work for paragraph form, audiobook format, as opposed to unit responses for total conversions and occasional lines for whatever Laconius is trying to build. And I think that it's important to bring that up because it shows the premise itself of the idea. It's sort of like proof purpose, or proof positive rather, that the process in which you do things is as integral as the project itself, probably more so. And this, we had already sort of discussed this prior to going live, but the idea that what your process is something that you're going to be using for longer than just however long it takes you to produce one project and complete something. It's something that you're going to iterate upon for, many, many years, as long as you stick within the same hobby. And sometimes it transcends hobbies and transcends genres and whatever else. So the idea that you're somebody who's done a lot of audio work, but have to adapt your process to something like a different format, a change in format, is pretty crazy to think because you've had so many years of experience, and yet that almost is no longer an asset because you have all these presuppositions coming into something about how it should be tackled, and you find out you got to change a lot of fundamentals. So I guess my question out of all that is, and then I have another one afterwards, is the fact that when you realized that you had to reevaluate a lot of things, and obviously you had extenuating circumstances in your life outside the process itself with the housing issue and the cat issue and your own personal health, combined with all of those external stressors, what was your MO at that point? What did you actually change about the process beyond just trying to pronounce certain words in a better way for like this format? Like, what was the big change that you made to your process to get to the point where you could actually finish this audiobook presentation of your idea that used to be a machinima, that used to be a mod?
It took a long road. I had to really change how I approached my work. So normally when I did like StarCraft stuff, because a lot of it was comparatively small scale, I would focus on one thing until it was done. But when I'm casting for hours and hours a night, I was actually like destroying my voice, and I was destroying my throat. So I just couldn't keep doing it night after night after night after night. I was also discovering that what you drank, what you ate, all these other factors dramatically impacted your voice. So the main character, Ajek, he's just my regular voice. And it was like I have to keep consistency with that voice through my time with it. Which means, for the 2 months it took to make that, I have to have exactly the same sounding voice every single day. And that was not happening.
Yeah, that's
and between being unable to pronounce stuff, it was so frustrating. I was getting so mad. And I was getting really, really, really pissed off. And I had to train myself to not get that invested in it, to understand that I was going to take longer to do things than I was comfortable doing, that there would be setbacks, and I had to redo a lot of stuff. Like, I had the dry runs. Obviously, I was going to redo those, but there was just so much redoing. I can't remember them now since it's been a while, but there were certain sentences that took me like 2 weeks to produce acceptable results for. And I still wasn't happy with some characters because I wasn't able to change my voice as much. Primarily Prince Adashim and Haktish. I really wanted more gruff voices for those. But the thing is, I didn't have anyone else I could depend upon for that. I didn't have anyone who could produce the voices I wanted. I needed older styled voices for them. And
well, on top of that, just based on what your own personal standard seems to have been for this particular time frame, I mean, you were retaking across many weeks and many months for the same sets of lines, and the idea that somebody else is going to do the same thing, I mean, that would be something that you wouldn't find that in the average person, even that swims in your circles. You wouldn't find that kind of dedication to a project that's not even theirs in the first place. Odds are, anyways.
Yeah, it was a grueling run. So I spaced out my work a lot. I decided, okay, so I've got 2 major things I need to do. First, I need to record audio, and then I need to process audio. So I tried to balance my work out, and I believe I may have been doing some recordings during this for LPs and stuff, but I was very focused on my work in this time. So I would have times where I would designate, even though if I felt like casting today, I'm not going to, because it's for my own mental health that I don't invest a lot of time into. And because I had to be mindful that even if I could force myself to work one day really, really hard and get a lot done, I still had this much more work to do anyways. So I tried to space out my commitments in which I would spend some time working on the composition because I had to time out a lot of stuff really precisely. And other times processing, I trained someone to do voice acting for me for Salvation, and she made a return in Retribution, and she had also started doing video casting, and I noticed, again, her quality had improved a lot since then. She had much more confidence. Still struggled with some words and stuff, but was better than any of the other female voice actors that I could have known at the time. Most of them didn't do voice acting anymore at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I had one guy that we had from Vent do some voice acting, but that was kind of it. I did pretty much every other voice in the thing, I'm pretty sure. And so I always had to be mindful that no matter how much I was struggling with one thing, there was always more work to do. This is how you manage a large project. You don't want to burn yourself out on one thing immediately. If it's giving you problems, take a step back and look at it later. But even if you can burn on something really hard, having the confidence that you can do something is an asset that doesn't really go away with time. So when I evaluate a project, it's like, what's going to be the hardest part? So if it was an audio only production, I had high confidence in that I could perform that project. And I knew that eventually, given time, I could do it. But I was getting really frustrated that I wasn't able to do it quickly. So I had to kind of like step back and say, okay, this is proving to be a problem. I'm having way more issues with certain strings of dialogue than I thought I was going to because of my speech disabilities and stuff like that, and just general inexperience talking because I don't socialize, so I don't have any, real world experience actually saying a certain dialogue. I know how to write it, I don't know how to act it. So time management is really important, and having something to bounce between. Before it was like videos and mods. That's why I was able to do consistent LPs and stuff, because I get really pissed off at sins. I would start doing recording instead. And all my projects suffered when I didn't have that. All my projects suffered when I didn't have something to kind of vent my frustrations on. And Retribution was shorter than most of the projects I've done, but it still amounted to the same thing, where you would get into toxic holes trying to overcome something. And you have to know when to stop and realize that that is happening, that you're stuck in something where continuing to throw yourself at it is actually just making it worse. And you need to like detox yourself and move on to some other aspect of the project, or distance yourself from the project entirely, sometimes for a really long time, and then come back to it later on. Also, I have to depart now for a few minutes. My grandmother requires assistance, so.
Well, that's all right. We'll take a quick break and then we'll get back to it and finish up where we were. So,
all right,
that's fine. So Mesk is still inundated, but I figured I can continue the discussion by myself for the time being, since I have gone to the bathroom and I have gotten some water, so I'm ready to talk some more. I think it's important to qualify that even though this video has dealt with an incredibly large amount of personal topics that are very much specific to Mesk, I think they illustrate a larger point about project management, time management, motivation, figuring out how to remain honest to your projects even after you have worked on them for months to years, and in fact very much so, how to maintain motivation and investment in them despite extreme external stressors, such as losing your house, or some physical illness, or death in the family, or whatever the case may be. I think that these are important, necessary lessons for humans to learn in the first place. That they have to deal with tragedy, they have to deal with misfortune, and you'll become a better person if you can stand up in the face of all of that and be able to still be dependable, to still be invested, to still be somehow able to carry on, despite the extreme lengths the world seems to have gone to break you down. Now, obviously, the universe is not acting in some pronounced plan, per se, but as general rules, those who are able to shoulder the burdens that the world throws at them that they receive by random in some cases and by design in others as a result of their own actions. I mean, that's those who are able to shoulder that and still find a way to occupy themselves and be happy and pursue quality typically are more productive individuals, more influential, inspirational individuals, just happier individuals in general. And you can make of that what you will, but I think that there is a specific element of that is reflected in this personal story that Mesk has told in this podcast. So we spent a long time discussing that sort of thing, and we'll probably wrap things up with regards to the podcast pretty soon once he returns. But I think it's still there are important takeaways that you can sort of extrapolate from this discussion, and that is that regardless of whether or not your project is anything to do with voice acting or commentating or casting, regardless of whether or not it has anything to do with using your voice at all, if you are working on a project and your problems with that project are seemingly fundamental and cannot be fixed in a very easy plug and play, hot swap, change X to Y manner, then you're probably looking at something that is in your process that needs to be overhauled. And that might be dealing with external stressors. That also might be simply figuring out a way to better separate yourself from your project and not get so stressed out at the project itself. It might be an internal stressor that's somehow causing you to have anxiety or stress over the project itself. Maybe it's nothing to do with stress. Maybe it's just that you're dissatisfied with the outcome of your process, and it's very much due to how that outcome was created, which is, of course, by your process. So I guess what it keeps circling back to is the idea that you have a process that needs to be modified in some way, almost always. And you can always iterate on your process. You can always adapt it to different genres, no matter how dissimilar they may seem. And, that's primarily because the common denominator is you in all of these equations. It's your role in the process and in the creation of the project. So, in so many words, what I'm saying is follow your dreams, No, it's what I'm saying is that your projects are not the most important thing. It's your process. It's your consistency. It's your efficiency. Generally speaking, what do you look at when people are inspirational to you? If you look at these YouTube Let's Players who release videos all the time, like I do, or Jay Barino, or anybody else who's in our field, and there's many people in this field. It's an incredibly oversaturated field, but if there are people out there that you aspire to be like in some capacity, one of the things that you should look at is how consistent they are. Now, if your quality isn't any good, then your consistency doesn't matter nearly as much, but the effort is still palpable by virtue of the consistency itself. And by extension, if you can extrapolate this into a StarCraft sense, there are people out there who have made a lot of campaigns, yet none of them were very good. Now, I don't personally think that maybe they... I don't personally put a lot of stock in their process, perhaps, but one thing is undeniable. They've made more campaigns than I did. I've only made one. 2 if you count Project Hydra. It's not done yet, but when it is done, maybe you can count that. Point is, you have a situation where you are looking at somebody who's able to create a lot of stuff over a long period of time and be consistent with it. Daily uploads for years on a Let's Play channel, or a campaign every year or every 6 months in a Brood War sense. Whatever the circumstances may be, there's some consistency there, and that should be your first stop, really, I think. After you get settled in and after you're acquainted to your recording environment for commentating, or your production environment for something like custom graphics for a mod, or voice acting for a mod, or whatever the case may be. Once you're comfortable with the way that you assemble stuff, you can look to improve quality in many different ways, but there's really only one way you can improve consistency, and that is by doing the work that you've laid out for you, by completing the process that you've developed. And You should iterate on that process to improve quality, but you should follow that process and do the work to improve consistency. And it's probably like the best way I can separate it out in my head. I don't even know if it makes any sense. And I actually expected Mesk would be back by now, so I have nothing else to say. I suppose we'll give it a couple more minutes, and if he doesn't return, we'll just wrap it up solo, and I'll ask him some follow-up questions on the next week's podcast. But this podcast went a couple of different ways. I was not expecting it to be as general purpose as it was. I knew that whenever you're talking about motivation for something, you can extrapolate it every which way and figure out different ways where it can plug into other environments, other formats, other mediums. But we ended up talking about a lot of foundational discussion topics, and I hope that those were useful, or at the very least interesting, even if you didn't really take anything away from it that you think will be particularly influential. Although, obviously, the educational and influential aspects are really what I'm after for this particular series. And I think we've done a pretty good job of doing that, especially with this and the previous podcasts. I feel like have been pretty solid. Maybe not to everybody's tastes. Maybe we spend a little bit too much time on certain details. But we'll take it under advisement if that's how you feel. Obviously, you have to let us know. But in general, I think that I'm really pleased with this podcast and the previous one. I feel like we've been really laying down our processes for you guys to take a look at. And I think that's a pretty good learning tool overall. So, what else is there to even say on the topic of casting environments and motivation? When I'm doing Let's Plays, and when I'm doing commentary, one of the things that I have noticed lately is that sometimes I go into autopilot mode. And it's something you always have to worry about regardless of what you're working within. Again, something that can be extrapolated to any number of different fields. But the automatic nature of how your brain settles into a pattern or groove that you've created over time, I mean, that's just because, you're on a neuroscientific level, which is a very bizarre way to explain this, but your neurons are firing in a certain way, and there's like a pattern to it. It's pretty similar every time, and as a result, a pathway forms that's you're not taking a path less traveled, you're taking a path that's frequently traveled. So as a result, you're going to be in a situation where your brain is used to firing that way, and your brain likes patterns. That's why when it sees something that bucks the trend, it's suspicious. And you should be suspicious of that, because it might just be bad data. But, all the same, you should be aware of your autopilot tendencies. I think that what happens for me is that I end up going back to traditional jokes or restating myself over and over again, repeating myself over and over again, and that's something I want to sort of curb going forward. But that's again figuring out what's wrong with your process and trying to modify it so that you can improve your quality and iterate on that process itself. So if you're struggling to figure out what to talk about, Mesk recommended something that's pretty easy. You just talk about what you're thinking. If you can't really figure out how to make that sound interesting, well, that's an area where you're going to improve the quality of your outcome, your project. You're iterating on the process, and instead of talking about everything that you're thinking and just turning your sort of your recording into a stream of consciousness, what you'd be turning it into is some sort of I guess it would just be some sort of environment where you're asking questions, posing questions, and answering them in some capacity. And obviously there's room for banter and jokes about, I don't know, we joked about Laconius in this podcast. I'm sure we've joked about plenty of other things, like World of Warcraft. People don't seem to like it when we joke about World of Warcraft, which makes it all the better when we do. But I think you have a situation where you can find a good balance between banter, jokes, etc., and substantive content, if that's sort of the market you're trying to get into. And I think that, people who do daily Let's Play videos have a bad name in people who are looking for high-quality stuff, because typically you don't see people who can put out content on a daily basis that is high quality. Especially a twice daily basis or whatever, however many times you're spamming people's sub boxes, you're going to be looking at a situation where, people are going to assume that if you're putting out content all the time on a regular basis, maybe your content isn't that great. Well, I don't think that has to be the case. Again, consistency is key. And holding myself to a standard where I upload videos every day, or almost every day, that's been a transformative process for me because it's something that I typically avoided. But I've shown myself that I can do it, and now there doesn't make any sense to change that right now, so until it does, I'm not going to. So when you have a situation where you're talking about, the identity of what you actually want to do, if you want to become a Let's Player, if you want to become a commentating channel where you talk about what you're thinking and your views, and you're basically start using your voice as a conduit for your personality so that other people can experience your personality and who you are as an individual, that's something that is going to bear some amount of repetition just by virtue of it being you, because you iterate on a lot of things as a person. So I wouldn't worry too much about repeating yourself too much. Obviously you want to avoid it if you can in certain respects, but you also have to be cognizant of the fact that not everybody who's watching video 10 in a series about Warcraft 3, for example, is going to have also watched your video on, video 7 on StarCraft 1 custom campaign where you explain something. So you might be dealing with different audiences. You also might be dealing with people who just forgot about it, and generally speaking, if it's something that is funny enough, I don't think people are going to mind, or interesting enough, I don't think people are going to mind that you repeat it in the first place. So it's really up to you what your personal standard is. You can use other people as a barometer. You can use other people as evidence of whether or not you're doing something that is valuable to them, and you can decide for yourself if that feedback that they're giving you is worthwhile in the first place, and you take it under advisement, and it's your responsibility and your prerogative if you want to decide to dispense with whatever they've given you and say, well, this isn't really valuable to me, I actually disagree with this person's assessment, or I don't think that the content that I'm producing would actually benefit from a change that they are suggesting. But maybe you do entertain what they are thinking. What they're basically telling you is, I think you could do this with your process. Or on the most basic level, if they just say you suck, then what they're saying is they don't like what your process has created. And it's not a very substantive comment, but, at the very least, it lets people, lets you know that opinion is out there, however insubstantial it actually is. So I would look for people who you trust with this sort of thing. Get them to, watch your video if you need a second set of eyes on it, and or get them to listen to your voice acting sample. Again, it can be anything. It could be playing a StarCraft map. It could be, you working on a game for the first time, and you're working on something in Unreal 4, and you're figuring out how to do all this stuff, and you're not really sure how it's going to translate into a finished project. Well, you build a level and you play it yourself, and if you're uncertain, as you probably will be if you're a newcomer to a certain area, then you would ask for comparisons. And that'll build cumulatively towards your experience as a content creator, regardless of what your medium actually is. So I think that's pretty important. There's certain things that you just get by doing with consistency. Again, it goes back to the idea that I think you should try to be consistent with a level of quality. Mesk was talking about how he had to be the same voice over and over again for 2 months for the purposes of recording a certain character and be consistent with that character. Well, that's the same idea, just taken to voice acting. You want to make sure that whatever voice you have for a character isn't altering while the character is still in development, or while the script is still in development. So if you have a script for a mission and a set of you have a script for a campaign, and map 1, there's a character in map 1 that's also in map 7, and there's 10 maps or something. Well, if you do map 1's recordings, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then do map 7's recordings, and the character that's only in those 2 maps sounds distinctly different from in map 7 compared to map 1, well, obviously you have an issue that you'd like to resolve. So, that's an instance of consistency. It's a little bit different, I guess, but still, the idea is there. You want to be consistently producing the same, using a similar process, maybe a superior process, and then you go back and change map 1's recordings, but, you want to at least be consistently putting out the same quality. You know, you don't want to be going lower. And if you're going lower, it should be for the purpose of experimentation, maybe. You know, there's plenty of instances where I make a one-off map that I don't publish anywhere, just for the purpose of practicing a certain AI technique or level design, you know, exploring concepts and seeing where they go. And, you know, that stuff will never be publicized. You know, it'll never be played by more than myself and maybe another person for the purpose of testing it if it's like a co-op thing. But other than that, you'll never see wind of it, but it will influence projects for a long time to come. You know, there's plenty of things that are like that have actually influenced projects that I have since released. Like, I've developed my current AI standard and the process with which I design my AI in all of my maps now from a project that will never see the light of day because I'm never going to finish it. And if I do finish it, it'll be something that is like so far removed from its original inception that it still won't represent what it originally was. And that's how it's going to be a lot. You iterate on your process. You figure out a way that is going to allow you to produce additional content or superior content in terms of a qualitative stance more consistently. Like, that's your ultimate goal, is to produce higher quality content more efficiently than you already do. And you go from that to, you know, you can separate that into individual parts. Well, I want to produce more content of the same quality with no quality loss, but more net content. Well, that's improving your efficiency. I want to produce higher quality content with the same efficiency, no efficiency loss. That's iterating on your process. So you can see how you can sort of go into multiple fields of upgrades. If you visualize it like an upgrade tree or something, then, you know, you're figuring out how to apply your skill points. Well, to get those skill points to begin with, you need to actually, you know, progress with a certain process and figure out exactly how to, you know, change it. So I think this concept can certainly be applied to a number of different things. And I think that no matter what you're doing, it could be music, it could be movies, it could be writing, or it could be what we talked about in this particular podcast. No matter what you're doing, there's an important amount of iteration on your process that should be considered. And if you're dissatisfied with your end product, check your process. If you're dissatisfied not by its quality, but by how efficiently and consistently you're able to put it out and, you know, ship updates to it or sequels to it or whatever, check your process. Look at what your process is, map it out, write it out, speak it into existence, record a log, write down a stream of consciousness of your thoughts, shape it into something that is actually tangible in some capacity. Maybe write it on a piece of paper if writing it on your PC doesn't do it for you. I do all three of these things. I write stuff down on paper, like what I did for this podcast is I just wrote notes based on what Mesk was saying, and I asked him follow-up questions based on that. You know, that's something that I wanted to do, is have a more guided conversation in these podcasts to begin with. So since I saw something that I didn't like about the podcast was that sometimes we would just leave loose ends over, and unfortunately we're doing that because Mesk isn't back yet, but, you know, under normal circumstances where he's here for the entire time, or at least returns from going AFK, we get into a situation where we can wrap things up, especially with the system that I've gotten where I write everything down. I have an idea for a question, I write it down. I'm writing down key notes that he's saying so that I can check him on those later if I have a thought that comes to me. You know, the act of writing it down forces you to become more invested in it, forces you to generate a higher quality product, makes it more consistent that you're going to generate that higher quality product, etc., etc. I don't like that I've been sort of lackluster in some of my commentaries lately, so I'm going to start writing down challenge questions or specific ideas that, like, posing certain questions that I think will drive up engagement in a way that I'm actually interested in and invested in. Like, there's ways that you can take a look at your... Yeah, exactly. You are back. Good. I was about to end the stream. So I was just saying that you can check your process. It really comes down to figuring out what you don't like about your project and what you're dissatisfied with it. Maybe you're dissatisfied with your consistency in releasing it. Maybe you're dissatisfied with the overall quality. But the end result is that you have to take a look at your process and how you're generating that project, and, you know, what is dissatisfactory to you. And the best way to do that is map it out. And I was talking about how I write a bunch of stuff out. I either on paper or on my computer or on my phone. I record logs. I speak things into existence. Just try to develop my thoughts a little bit more. That's there's all these different ways that you can basically map out your process so that you understand it better, and that will help you to separate it into individual elements that you can then modify. But when we had left off before you had gone, we were talking about, you were discussing the ins and outs of Retribution and how it had turned into an audiobook, and basically the process in which you were specifically talking about like voice actors outsourcing voice work, but how the fact that you had done most of the voice work had been very straining on you, not only your voice, but the idea that you had to maintain the same voice for months on end, and how that wasn't really likely to happen. And one of the things that really, that alongside your discussion on how you got ahead of yourself, and you described it as being greedy with Salvation and how you released it early, was that, consistency is pretty key. And I guess this ties into what I was talking about before you got back.
So the stuff I'm posting in chat is Retribution assets in Unreal 4.
I have
If
no
you have
idea
a
how
means
I'm
of
going
showing
to...
those.
Yeah, I should be able to.
So what you're looking at here is about 1.5 years of labor that has no use in anything else, and will basically sit on my hard drives doing utterly nothing for the end of time. And I was pretty close to the end of my discussion. There was something I was going to talk about. Obviously, going from this to audio only was a big shift. You throw away something you spent so long working on, and it's in large part like you can throw your blame at someone else, and the fact they didn't help you or whatever, all you want, but the net thing of the net result is that the only reason you had to depend on someone else was because you yourself were not capable of making the project. I only have myself to blame for the way Retribution ended. I only have myself to blame for, being unable to make the content that I needed for my project. And I have a process in which I make things, and I actually do very little planning. Retribution was the only project in which I did planning, and it was very superficial. I planned out the script. So the audiobook today is about 3 hours long. 50% of it was improvised on the spot, and I think those are the strongest parts of it. Most of the stuff I conjure on the spot tends to be of a higher quality than anything I planned. I put very, very little energy into planning. I don't think that you should do anything more than superficial, like, this is what I want to do, this is where I want to be. Now figure how I'm going to get up there. Because these things all take a long time, and you are going to spend a long time interacting with this project, and things are going to change along the way, and what you want is going to change and evolve along the way, and you will just subconsciously set yourself up for disappointment along the way. I try not to make too much plans. I never was a planning guy in any of my StarCraft projects with Armageddon Onslaught. I said, hey, I have a bunch of ideas I'm going to try out, and we're going to see if they work. They didn't work. With the Retribution, I was like, I need ships for this and this and this. This is roughly what I need, and these are the kind of ideas I've got. I store them in my head. I wrote out only a little bit. And I just focused my mind on actually creating stuff. With the audiobook, I wrote out the script, and in text, I described very basically what kind of sound effects I needed for areas that I knew I would forget and be unable to remember on the spot because my memory is terrible. But for the vast majority of it, I would listen to it over and over and over and over and over, and I'd think, what would go good with this? What would complete this? Or is this necessary? Do I need to have this here? Don't be afraid to cut. In fact, you should be cutting. You should be cutting as much as you possibly can, both to save yourself time and because the more you cut, the more you can make out of what you have left behind.
Well, that's the whole idea of trimming the fat in the first place, is there's unnecessary stuff. And this goes back to something that's like a foundational principle, especially when I'm talking about story writing in particular, is that I have a firm belief that when you're trying to communicate something, you can basically the shorter amount of time you're allotting yourself to communicate that, be it a a short story or a shorter audio bit, the shorter amount of time you're allowing yourself to communicate, the higher the margin of error becomes, and thus the higher the skill barrier is for people who are trying to tell stories in the first place. And this is why you see a lot of bloated stories from people's first projects, is because they don't really know exactly what they're trying to tell, and there's a lot of unnecessary asides that the story may take, and maybe some information that could have been presented a lot better. I mean, basically, what I'm describing is very amateurish things like flame knives and StarCraft 2, where you have situations where, you just have a lot of wasted time, a lot of things that if you had decided I'm going to show this stuff instead of expositing it while Alarak walks from point A to point B back and forth in a patrol animation or something on your ship, he could be actually fighting in a battle, and you could be observing that, and that could be like, oh, this is Rakshir, this is this battle that these guys do to prove who's the dominant one in the bedroom or something. Like, whatever your lore happens to be, you can show this happening, and by virtue of it being a celebrated event, it's a regular thing, it's something that's directly linked to this culture, and all these other things that you're basically just told, and then you just forget about it afterwards. So the idea that you have less to work with because you've cut so much, well, generally speaking, if you're cutting all of the stuff that's unnecessary, that you find out that you don't actually need, that doesn't add anything of substance, or that can be reworked into something that's more concise, I think you're going to have a stronger end product just as a result. And that's an integral part of the process in the first place, is getting your first sets up and then figuring out what can I lose from this and still retain the essence of the project.
Yeah, pretty much. So I don't really have too much else to add without getting into really abstract subjects that could take a long time. So let's see if anything specific you want to add. I think that's pretty much it for Retribution. I think the net result is pretty clear.
Well, I guess the only question I would have is then, what are you, as a result of these lessons that you've learned by virtue of carrying out this project to its final conclusion, and as a result of all of the circumstances surrounding that as well, have you learned something valuable to, have you, I guess we'll go at it from a different angle, actually. Have you given up trying to justify the amount of time spent and, in your opinion, it seems wasted? Or have you just allowed it to be a sort of stain or however, I don't know how you characterize it in your own head, but judging by the language you use, it seems you hold that era of time in some sort of contempt, and yourself in contempt for allowing it to happen. So is there a silver lining there that you're willing to walk away from, or is it something that in general you would rather have not occurred at all?
I think had I been successful with Retribution as I should have been, I would be much happier right now. I see the audiobook as defeat. I see it as, I was forced to reduce something to this point when very much someone with my experience should not have needed to. There's no reason I should have needed to do anything audio only. I have no excuse for being unable to make character models. I have no excuse for being unable to take something out of another game and remaster it and make characters out of it. I have no excuse for the amount of time I've put into this content to be reduced to this point. But here we are. And that in itself is a disappointment I will never outlive, because I no longer produce custom content. And I couldn't outlive, even if I did produce custom content, because it's a shadow I can never escape. Even if I improve from now, it's still, you spent 18 years, 19 years making mods, making, campaigns, making just stuff, while not learning anything that actually was tangibly useful in creating something you genuinely wanted to create in 3 separate instances. That's a black mark that I don't think I'll ever escape. Independently of that, the audiobook, I'm content with it. I see a lot of flaws in it, but for only 2 months of work with no prior experience, I'm willing to say it's okay. I'm not really partial to it, nor do I think of it really negatively.
I had considered doing updates to it, but I don't think I will. I think that it was an alright solo venture for jumping into audiobooks, but I won't do it again. And in some ways, it was all a necessary learning experience. You know, it was a lot of personal growth in the sense of coming to terms that I am just not a content creator. I have no business trying to make content. I have no business trying to make mods. I have no business trying to make machinima. I have no business trying to voice act. I have no business trying to make graphics. I may be able to analyze and assess this stuff. I may be able to critique it. I may be able to know what's good and what's not good. But, you know, so long as I have these disabilities, so long as I'm not able to learn, then I can't actually physically do anything with them myself. I'm basically stuck in the same spot that people like Artosis were, where they played this game and tried to be professional, but they couldn't. So they became casters instead and sort of watched from the sidelines. And that's effectively what I've been delegated to. So I've learned also to take value in what I can accomplish, which is my video projects, in that I can complete those. And I can continue to work on those. And I can create something fully fleshed out and actually release it. Unlike Retribution, where I had to basically destroy it to complete it. So I kind of don't, in a way, I don't really enjoy making videos. I do it on behalf of it being really the only thing I can do. But I do find some sustenance in doing so. So it's more like, you know, this is how I'm going to spend my time. But I'm going to always wish that I had been able to do better with Retribution. Because that was the defining moment, the destruction of my passion. And there's pretty much no turning back from that.
Well, I appreciate you being candid about it. I'm sure it's something you've been mulling over for a while. So, guess that's, I don't know, I was trying to figure out how to tie that into the overarching idea of motivation, but...
Well, motivation plays into it because you got to have something driving you to push yourself to make those concessions.
Well, your motivation in this instance is you want to make the best quality project. You want to make something
I wanted to bring something to life, specifically.
Right.
I wanted to bring something to life in a manner I could respect. And
by virtue of not being able to...
graphics.
Right.
So I cut graphics. And then it got to the audio... And I realized, well, I can do a good chunk of it in audio. I can't do all of it in audio. But I had to because I had no other choice. And it brings me back to making, you know, mods and stuff where I needed graphics or something for that as well. And it ultimately comes down to, can you do it? No, don't bother trying. If you can't be completely independent, it's just not worth getting involved. That's really like the big thing I take away from this is don't start projects, especially something that you yourself want to create, under the pretense of having outside help. It will bite you in the ass. No matter who you depend upon, it will come to bite you in the ass.
Yeah, I can confirm that much. Well, in that case, I think learning to rely on yourself is probably like the biggest, most important element of the entire idea of motivation as a concept that can even be taught. And as a result of that, I think we've probably done a fine job of summarizing that, of arguing for that position. And
because if you can't motivate yourself, how are you going to motivate other people?
Right, it goes back to the idea of you're trying to be a voice actor or a commentator. Well, if you can't live with your own voice, how are you expecting other people to? So, yeah. very similar concept. Way to bring it all the way back around. So, I guess unless you have anything else to add, that can probably be where we leave off.
We can continue more later.
Right, for sure. So, in that case, happy birthday, Necron.
Happy birthday, Necron.
The cops are coming for me.
They're coming for your birthday privilege.